Rapid7 powers the practice of SecOps. Using shared data, analytics, and automated workflows, SecOps unites IT, DevOps, and security teams to make security an outcome of innovation. Rapid7 combines technology, expertise, and advocacy to drive vulnerability management, application security, incident detection, and log management for more than 7,000 organizations worldwide. Power up your SecOps practice with a free trial at rapid7.com/securityweekly. Hard-coded credentials can be trouble, but not as much trouble as a vulnerable DevOps environment. If you want protection without the hassle of security slowing you down, CyberArk, the #1 provider in privileged access security, has the solution for you. With CyberArk Conjur, developers can easily secure secrets across any DevOps toolchain or platform, whether your application runs in the cloud or on-premises. Eliminate the headaches of managing secrets and try Conjur open source for free with no strings attached. Visit conjur.org/ASW to get started today. Layered Insight is the industry's first embedded security approach for containers. Trusted by Global 1000 enterprises to secure their containerized applications, it's the only solution that requires no root privileges, has zero dependency on the underlying infrastructure, and is fully portable across any container environment. Unify DevOps and SecOps, enabling the rapid development of containerized applications without worrying about security. To learn more, please visit layeredinsight.com/ASW.
Welcome back, everyone, to the news for the week of June 3rd. Technically, today's the 4th, but it's the week of June 3rd. I have a couple quick announcements before we jump into the news. First, go to itpro.tv/securityweekly and use the code SECWeekly30 to try a free 7-day trial and receive 30% off of your monthly membership for the lifetime of your active subscription. In addition to that, go check out some of our on-demand content at securityweekly.com/on-demand. This material is, of course, available free for any Security Weekly listener to go ahead and check out. Be sure to check out the State of the Penetration Testing video by Black Hills Information Security. Again, huge fan of John Strand and team over there. And all of the other additional pre-recorded videos that you might have missed, which are pretty awesome. I know that I did one with you, Paul, about a month or two ago at this point. So yeah, I've been on at least one. I'm sure many of the other hosts here at Security Weekly have been involved in that as well. So check it out. I think you guys will enjoy it. Last one, BugCrowd is hiring, of course. As many people know, we did have a recent Series C funding round. There's some heavy amounts of hiring in the Boston area. So if you happen to be local to Boston, definitely check out bugcrowd.com/careers. I know they just opened up a solutions architect role, which is currently what I do at BugCrowd as well. So if you have questions, email me, hoodie@securityweekly.com. Happy to answer any questions you might have about that. This week, Paul, the news is hot on Git. Specifically, there is a remote code execution vulnerability in the Git protocol, which I thought was kind of scary because when I went ahead and checked the version of Git I was using on both my DigitalOcean boxes and, of course, my local device, I found that I was, in fact, vulnerable to this. Did you read anything about this? I know that you did say you wanted me to go into it a little bit deeper, but did you see anything beyond the article that I linked on the show notes, Paul?
No. So I tried to read and understand this vulnerability in Git, right? And I just couldn't. I don't know. I couldn't wrap my brain around it well enough to be able to communicate it. I tried on, I think, last week's Paul Security Weekly, but I'm curious for your analysis.
Yeah. So what it is in this case is with crafted.git modules. And so a Git module is a sub-module property. So it's located in the top-level directory of like your Git file or your Git profile. And it contains a subsection per module, and each subsection value is the name of that sub-module that is going to be used. So you can like add sub-modules into your code according to what you might need from, different bits of code that you might have written from different parts of your organization, different libraries that effectively you're pulling in.
So if I have a sub-repository, basically like I'm writing my code and I'm like, oh, I need to pull code from another repository, and I can basically like include that and make a call and include that other repository's code?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That's exactly the way to think of it is in terms of an analogy, that's exactly the way that it works. And
which
so,
is usually, just want to point out at this stage in the game, usually where our security people start shaking our heads because historically this type of process is really bad. Like, oh, you can just include, this JavaScript in an iframe. It's totally fine. It comes from another site.
Right, exactly.
Totally fine.
It's the same problem, just presented in a different way, exactly. Right? It's like everything old is new again.
Yep.
And in this case, it's exactly what happens here is with the crafted.git module file, which is in a malicious project, you can execute arbitrary script on a machine that includes git clone of recursive submodules. because those submodule names are obtained inside of that file and then appended to the Git directory's modules folder just with directory traversal. You can use // to actually move the modules out from the submodules into the regular or the main modules of your Git project. So in effect, you can get remote code execution. And of course, from there, if they can do like directory traversal, they can start calling things inside of your code that they shouldn't be able to call. So yeah, it was just all bad because in this case, with post-checkout hooks from a submodule when they're executed, you can bypass intended design, which hooks are not actually supposed to be able to obtain on a remote server. So in this case, it's like, okay, now you've suddenly got hooks or post-checkout hooks and the submodules that are executed. So if those hooks are making calls out to the internet, like you've got problems.
Is this common practice to include a Git subrepository like from an open internet accessible project into my repository? Is that how?
Honestly, I don't know, Paul, because I have never done anything with the submodules myself.
I've never used Git. I know that there is a process for vetting software that you're getting from the internet in your build processes, right? And scrub it. So I have talked with people that are like, yes, we like use the, I don't know, let's say it's the MySQL container. Like we download that and we run it through our own internal checks. Then we run it through our own internal QA checks for the new, so security testing, then QA checking. Once we verify it's good, then we stuff it in our new project and we only use that locally obtained version. And then our process for updating basically has to go through, notification, there's a new MySQL container, run it through functional testing, run it through security testing, and then include it in our project. So it seems to me like if you're vulnerable to this kind of stuff, like you're way too trusting of other people's repositories and code.
Well, and the other part of it too, in reading the Git documentation as well, is basically it's you want to be able to treat two projects as separate, yet still be able to use them from within the other, right? So you want to be able to kind of co-locate or co-call that code into one project as kind of a uniform project. The way that I can see this actually working is even inside of an organization where you're not making call outs to third-party code, but maybe you have a code repository that you are using in common with one another, right? So you're working on a monolithic project, the Spotify desktop application, but each team is on a feature-specific building process, right? So the submodules in this case are the features that are getting called into the monolithic application as the monolithic application is being compiled. So in that end, I can actually see it also being used for everything we just talked about in the previous segment, which is, in this case, if you have agile teams that are working on different features, they could all be using one code repository like GitHub, for example. And then from there, being able to call all that code together in the compilation process, which might be done through a DevOps build process like Jenkins, and then be compiled and run through tests.
But you'd still need to gain access to their repository and make a change to their files, right, that are being automatically included. And so in that case, the internal risk to me is kind of low because, I mean, if someone does have access to your source code repositories, you're pretty screwed anyway, or at least your Git, internal Git or maybe public Git, like you should protect those things. Now, this vulnerability, I think, makes it easier for an attacker to execute an attack for sure, but an attacker with this level of access, Keith, an attacker can do a lot of things. This vulnerability aside, right?
Well, so here's the thing, Paul, is the scenario that you originally talked about, which is the third party situation, is exactly the problem that I think that this is actually going to be used in.
Yes.
And what's interesting is actually, I'm going to bounce around a little bit here because under Food for Thought story number 2, it actually is a story about the percentage of open source code in proprietary applications today is on the rise. So a couple of the metrics that they pulled out from this report, for example, was that for 96% of the scanned applications for this, it was Black Duck in this case, that was performing a survey.
This survey, that also the same survey said that 96% of the scanned software is found to be open source or whatever, because if
contained open source components.
Yeah. Well, that's anyway. If I don't have any open source software, why would I engage with Black Duck? Because they
right.
Anyway. I mean, no, they're trying, dude. They got to give them credit for trying, but sometimes the survey stuff just tells you stuff that's so stinking obvious that I'm like, really? You had to do a survey to tell me that? I could have told you that most of your customers have open source software.
Right. Because that's the entire premise of what they sell.
Exactly.
So the other interesting metrics that I still think are valid here, which is, in this case, the average percentage of open source code in those projects that they were scanning went from 36% last year to 57% this year. Right?
Now, see, that's an interesting statistic. They should have taken the first bullet and just not even put it in there, because now your survey data, fine, you sponsored a survey, but now you're giving the community some useful statistics. And talking about growth is the kind of statistic I like to see. And this one is very interesting. Like if you've got 300 customers, let's say, and they're scanning all their open source software, and you can give me a statistic that says, well, like, what is it, over the course of a year? The average percentage, I don't know, they didn't list the time frame. Anyway, they say the average percentage of open source software grew from 36 to 50. That's useful. That does tell me that, like you're saying, there is more. Now, even better if you can tell me, like, was that software more vulnerable or less vulnerable? And I mean, they could give you a sampling of that potentially, depending on, how they're able to collect anonymous data from their customers.
And they go into that a little bit, right? So, like, for example, they cover here that something like for JavaScript, it was 40% of applications scanned. They actually had JavaScript open sourcing or using open source tools in about 40% of those instances. jQuery, about 36% of the instances, it was, open source jQuery
but also,
library.
All this data you have to take with a grain of salt, because don't forget, anytime we do these surveys, the organizations that have spent the time, money, and effort to buy, purchase, implement and purchase Black Duck are already at a level of security conscious, like on the security conscious scale, like they're pretty well up there. To really get a sense of the problem, you got to pull people that don't have this software. And how do you do that if they don't have the software that's auditing their code repositories for open source software? That's in one of my issues. Like, it's all great to say, like, there's more open source software in all these repositories, but they're already using open source software, so why wouldn't they use more, right? What I really want to know is maybe, and I don't know how you gauge this outside of the scope. Have you seen how are the increases?
So the other thing that I still thought was perhaps good data, though, within this is the analysis of the code bases. In 78% of the instances, they found at least one vulnerability, but the average vulnerability or the average vulnerability count across those code bases was 64 per application, which I thought was a lot, right? But also it gets a little bit to the idea of the open source model, which is not a push of a patch or an update. It's a pull model, right? So you have to depend on developers or automation to actually pull updates to all of the open source libraries that you're using or that you're calling out to.
But now, so hold on. Now I'm going to wipe out their second statistic that says they grew from 36 to 57%. So if you were a customer and you bought a product that helped you secure your open source software, wouldn't you use more of it?
True. Fair point. So
sorry, I feel like I'm picking on Black Duck, but I just can't.
The best thing is there's an actual, I forget who the quote is from, but there's a great quote, which is, there are three kind of lies. There are lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Yeah.
So I think that it was interesting just to see some of the different changes, especially when they talk about IoT applications, because that had 677 vulnerabilities, like an order of magnitude higher vulnerabilities in those instances where they were found using open source code.
But you're always going to find more vulnerabilities for two reasons. One, people that buy your products are going to use more open source software, which is just increasing the likelihood you're going to find a vulnerability. And number two, as a company, you're probably growing and writing more checks, writing more checks, not more like money checks, writing more security checks for more open source software, and therefore you're going to find more vulnerabilities. So I don't think I can draw anything conclusive from any of this survey data, to be honest with you. I'm sorry.
It's unfortunate that there isn't like a third-party organization similar to I'm trying to remember his name.
Well, now, certainly I think Microsoft buying GitHub. Did we talk about that yet, or did I just?
No, we haven't.
But it's a great segue into that story, because there's someone that GitHub could provide their own statistics. I think with Microsoft now owns them, could provide a great set of statistics, because anyone who's writing software, you could use GitHub. So it doesn't have that premise like I'm using open source software or how much I'm using it, right? Like you're using GitHub. And GitHub did build, and we covered it, right? Certain checks for vulnerable, and I hope that continues now with the I think it will, is my prediction with the Microsoft acquisition, that it will automatically check for vulnerabilities and report them. And we did cover the statistics for that, I think, on this show. Yeah, those were a lot more compelling because it was just like, hey, we're pulling our customers, and yeah, people are doing, and there were still some things with that data that we could pick on as well.
So the interesting thing about GitHub being purchased by Microsoft, it's funny because a lot of people today are freaking out about it. They're saying, oh, we're going to move our code. We've deleted all our private repositories. We're migrating to other providers. And the thing that gets me is a fewfold, right? So the whole uproar about this grinds my gears just a little bit. Because first of all, Microsoft isn't Facebook and they aren't Google. Right. So their model is not to sell your data. Therefore, in my mind, the purchase from Microsoft is actually probably really good because it means that it's going to inform the way that they develop products.
And I think this move was totally all about, and I agree with you, privacy-wise, I don't think we should be all up in arms about this because I think the acquisition was solely fueled by, hey, if we can get GitHub, we can move people closer to Azure because, hey, if you're in GitHub, now we control GitHub, we control Azure, so we can integrate the two together so that you can have a much better process for developing and implementing your software on our platforms, because now the Microsoft platform is GitHub and Azure. And I totally think it was just a move into the cloud. I mean, I talked about an article 2 years ago, they tried to buy Docker.
Yeah.
If they could add Docker into the mix, they'd be totally positioned to offer that DevOps suite to people, because Git plays a huge role, I'm learning, in DevOps. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a big player 100%. In the DevOps and probably in Agile as well, right? And it's more than just like checking out code. There's other features in there, like their ticketing system and other things that are automatically building in your process. Microsoft totally bought them so that more people would move over to Azure. I just think that's the way it is.
The thing that people, I laugh, right? Because people are like, oh, we're going to move to GitLab or Bitbucket, right? And so GitLab, tomorrow could be bought by Facebook or Google. And I don't know that they're going to have the same intentions as Microsoft is with their purchase. And moreover, Microsoft, according to the articles that were released today, both by the GitHub blog and Satya Nadal, the blog that was written by Microsoft is the biggest contributor to open source in recent years on GitHub, which is like, people are freaking out about, Microsoft has this really bad rap as being a very closed source company, but they've hired some really amazing open source developers like Jesse Frizzell.
Yeah, no, they're not like that anymore. They're not. They've totally changed the culture. When I talk to people at Microsoft and read about Microsoft articles, even the ones that are just related to security, you can tell their entire outlook, not pun intended, I guess, has changed on that. So,
yeah, and to that end, I mean, I'm really enthusiastic about this, quite frankly. I think that this is an excellent purchase. It does move people closer to the Azure platform. I agree with you.
But they're not going to forget about AWS, though, right? Because, I mean, if I'm a paying subscriber to GitHub and I happen to be using AWS, like, they're not going to kick me to the curb or give me a reason to move, right? They want to retain as many subscribers as possible.
You know what they do, though, is they're going to give you some sort of allowance and one-click push to Azure functionality, and it's just going to become easier, right? Like, that's the way that they need them, is they're just going to make it so easy to just use Azure. And oh, by the way, as we talked with, was it Adam a few weeks ago, about Azure in general, Azure has a lot of really great built-in security by default functionality.
And they have a container platform on Azure? We keep saying Azure or Azure. I don't know what it is. Azure.
I don't know.
I think it's Azure.
Maybe
anyway,
we'll get someone on to talk about making
both
sure.
I'm going to say both are acceptable right now on the show until someone from Microsoft corrects us, which I'm sure now is going to happen now that I've said that.
Right,
sorry, Keith. Anyway, but Azure has its own container service similar to Amazon's ECS.
That I believe to be the case. I don't know exactly what they've called it because they have their naming scheme is weird, quite
Mm.
frankly, right? Like AWS has got like all the different like RDS and like different things that they've done.
Yes.
As far as I understand that, yes, in fact, that you can fully use containers and container repositories and things of that nature inside of Azure or Azure. I don't know how we're going to call it. People are going to write in and say it's Azure, not Azure, and
Right.
it's like you're not going to know because you're going to be
Yeah.
reading as opposed to hearing.
Right.
But all the same, I believe that in fact, yes, they do because of course any cloud provider today needs to, right? That's why Google's supporting Kubernetes so heavily. I think that's why AWS is trying to straddle the fence a little bit and is working.
Well, yeah, AWS is just totally gone. Like Fargate is just like whatever. We'll manage everything. We'll manage everything for you. Give us your containers. We'll be the orchestrator. Like all you got to do is just give us your containers, and we're running with it. And that's really what we're looking at to run our application here. I think is the ultimate progression. Will be Fargate because it's a smaller application, and why not go serverless? I mean, I don't know. Right. That's kind of my. If you believe otherwise, please tell me why. I understand it's going to limit you to that specific technology potentially, but when you think about it, like a container can be a container. Like the ways you define a container are only so finite, right? There's not a whole lot of. I mean, maybe as you get more complex, certainly for small applications, I think it's pretty ubiquitous, right?
I think at some point we definitely are going to be talking about serverless in more detail as well. Probably even have someone on to interview about it. Somebody recently sent me a really good article on serverless security, which I thought was really nice. And I've been reading through it. So.
You know what's nice is we get like 8 million requests from PR companies for people to come on the show. And I'm like, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And basically they're all looking to sell their product, right? But we can flip the tables and say, yeah, all right, all that's fine. But we want an expert to come talk about this, and maybe that's AWS Fargate, right? Like they're happy to provide us with someone to talk with. Now we vet just like we vet all of our sponsors and partners, we vet all of our interviews before they come on the show. So we'll make sure it's not a sales pitch, but it could be about a product or a technique that is of genuine interest. Certainly Fargate is for me. I'd love to have someone from Microsoft come on and talk about Azure, especially in the light of containers as well. So I think this is content that we need to bring forth to our audience, which I think developers, ops people, and security people really need to know all the things that we're talking about, Keith, in terms of technology.
Well, it's agile DevOps in the making. One last thing that I want to make sure we covered here, by the way. Speaking of solutions to problems, number 0 under if you build it, they will come. I will not mention the vendor's name on the show because I want to be somewhat respectful to them. But their solution to GDPR for their scanning solution was to turn the last octet under their collection mode to 0 on their vulnerability management scans. That's how they were meeting GDPR requirements. I literally wanted to just smash my head into the keyboard because how do you know which system on your network inside that /24 space is vulnerable if they all end in 0? I'd really like to know.
I think there's a large misconception about GDPR, to be honest with you. And everything I've heard about it and talk with people, like in larger companies, I agree. Like you potentially you got to do some stuff and you got some issues, right? Smaller companies, I mean, you can say like, look, if you want access to know about your data or delete your data, just contact us. We'll work you through it. Right. As long as you do that, that's totally fine. In my opinion, I don't know. Maybe it's not. I'm not a lawyer or pretend to know every aspect, of these regulations. But I think in this particular case, they're talking about the IP address, right?
Right.
But doesn't an IP address have to be associated with someone to be considered underneath? I mean, just IP addresses are just IP addresses, especially if they're internal IP addresses. It's just an IP address if it's not identifiable. Maybe in this particular case, it is identified to a person, right?
Well, think about the fingerprinting problem, right? So like vulnerability management solutions have been working on fingerprinting devices so that sysadmins can go and patch that specific device, right? They try to figure out what it is, where it lives, and how they can go about fixing it. So in that case, I think that the IP address is enough of an identifier to be considered a problem. I mean, clearly...
Well, yeah, I mean, in your vulnerability scan results, it says, well, this user is the username that was used on this device, and then, then there you go.
Right. So to that end, this vendor's particular response is perplexing. but we shall leave them nameless. If you want to go check it out and confirm for yourself, story number 0 under if you build it, they will come on the wiki. Now, on the other hand, other companies have been responding to GDPR pretty, intelligently or maybe just lazily. Story number 1 under the if you build it section is actually a link to a tweet post where any TechCrunch or Oath-owned property, so I think that's like AOL, Yahoo, etc., if you include the $GUC counter equals 2 at the end of your query, you suddenly have no more tracking or ads associated with your browsing session. Which to me is like, okay, they basically just said, look, anybody that browses to this, which is going to be anyone that's in an EU country, maybe they're doing it by ISP or what have you, is just appending it to their request, you're good. Like, they're not going to have any ads. So I get the feeling that that's a very lazy way to try and solve the problem.
Because now it's just like every ad blocker on the planet is just going to use that tactic, regardless of where you're from.
Exactly. So it's just like it blows me away. But
it's like the evil bit on packets. Like you only need to block the packets that have the evil bit set. I mean, what else are we going to do with those unused TCP or IP header space? Right? Might as well just say anyway.
Right. Yeah. And so
bad idea.
The other thing, by the way. We'll talk about this, I'm sure, because today was Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference. And so one of the things that they talked about specifically today in today's big announcement that they do was 2 things. First, they're, of course, launching yet another Mac OS called Mojave. So they're getting away from the mountains and now doing other parks.
No, they're doing the desert?
Yeah, I guess.
I guess so. Anyway.
So what they did, though, is they actually kind of came out with 2 things. First, Safari is now intelligently built to block any sort of tracking mechanisms such as like buttons or comment fields inside of your browsing session. So they're basically taking it to the streets when it comes to tracking and advertisements on the web through Safari, which is, I think, following suit with what Firefox has already been doing with their new Quantum release, which is, I think, Firefox 57. And then on top of that, though, they're doing additional fingerprint restrictions on the operating system level. So that way now, anytime you actually browse to a site, you can no longer get things like, plugin details or other bits of information that can be used to fingerprint your unique presence on the web with the new Mac OS version, which I was really excited about. If we have any Apple developers in the house that worked on Mac OS that are listening to the show, reach out. We'd love to talk to you about that. hoodie@securityweekly.com. That would be a really awesome thing to talk about. Are there any other news stories, Paul, that you want to...
I meant to mention that certain companies are extremely difficult to deal with when it comes to press and public relations. Apple probably being at the top of that list, Keith. So we can ask, but yeah. Anyway,
we probably won't get anybody.
Large software company that is awesome to work with in that capacity is, in fact, Microsoft. And there have been several people from Microsoft on several of our shows as a result. Which anyway. So what I was going to ask you, what else did anything else come out of the WWDC?
There were a couple of interesting things. I didn't catch all of it. I mean, they did talk a lot about App Store changes that they were making. Of course, they've got all sorts of interesting things going on with the new iOS 12 that they're coming out, including like, augmented reality, AR. And so there was one point where some developers from Lego were like out on the stage playing with their iPads and augmented reality. And I was just like, are there really just people like playing with Legos and iPads right on stage for this? I was a little bit blown away by it. It was good. I mean, I didn't see anything earth-shattering that I didn't already really know. I don't think they released any huge new product lineups as a result of today's WWDC. But I was really enthused by the changes to iOS 12. So they're doing all sorts of, again, privacy changes there. They're actually building it for performance for all currently supported iOS 11 phones are also going to be supported under iOS 12, which is a break with previous releases of iOS. Versions that they've kind of always broken one version beyond where they currently were. And they're actually making them more performant, which I thought was also really interesting. So, I'm sure we're going to talk about that on a future episode, probably next week in the news, because I think there was a lot of good that came out of today's WWDC. But I also find it hilarious that Microsoft announces it's buying GitHub on the same day. Right. I don't know if they're, stealing the Microsoft
that was done on purpose for sure.
Well, apparently, I think LinkedIn was done it the same way a few years ago as well. So that is.
I mean, I can't say for sure, but I think that's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
Dealings there.
Market.
Yeah, exactly. Cool.
So with that, I just want to again thank everyone for listening to another episode of Application Security Weekly. Go update your Git installation, and as always, remember to git commit, stay classy.